Okay, so hi everyone, welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. We have Dyer from the University of Oxford, who will talk about ABC with path signatures. Thank you, Joel.
Thank you, Massey, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak here. It's great to be here. So I'm Joel. I just finished my PhD in applied maths at Oxford. I'm going to talk about ABC with path signatures. And this was joint work with Patrick Canning and Sebastian Schmon, two of my collaborators. It's just been updated. We had a revision up on the archive. It's just been updated. So please check that out if you're interested in seeing some of the changes. And I guess the aim of this presentation is that I will try and convince you that these things called path signatures can be a useful tool for doing ABC when you've got time series simulators of some kind. And so to that end, I'll just give a bit of context first on the problem that I'm sure we're familiar with, but just for the sake of setting up some notation. And then I'll move on to motivating and introducing path signatures. And then I'll describe how we incorporate them into ABC and show some of the results that we get when we use them in ABC. So there we go. Just to quickly provide some context, the problem that we're considering is that of doing parameter inference for stochastic simulation models, by which I mean models that are implemented as computer programs that make use of random number generators internally. And for such models, forward simulation is easy and can be represented as a draw from the model's likelihood function, v of x given theta, where here I'm taking x to be some time series of some sort, and the parameters are in some subset of d-dimensional Euclidean space. And one of the problems with simulation models is that evaluating the model's likelihood function is usually difficult or impossible for an arbitrary x theta combination. And this makes inferential problems more difficult because many classical inference techniques in statistics involve the model's likelihood function. And an example of this that we're all familiar with is Bayesian inference, in which the posterior is computed as in this way, where the likelihood function appears in this and the numerator here. So one way to get around the problem of an intractable likelihood function when it comes to inference is to resort to simulation-based inference procedures, such as ABC, in which a posterior of this form is targeted, where k is a kernel function with bandwidth parameter epsilon, and boldface S here is a summary statistic of the data. And then, broadly speaking, this procedure tends to assign high posterior density to regions of the parameter space that produce data that are sufficiently close to the real data, where this notion of closeness is introduced through this kernel function k. So this choice of kernel function is relatively important since it helps to determine the behavior of the ABC posterior and determine where posterior mass is allocated. And these kernels typically make use of a distance function internally, which I'll denote with a calligraphic d. And these distances are computed between, as I said, in general, summary statistics of the data. And there are various choices available, such as a uniform kernel, where simulations are rejected or parameter values are rejected if the simulation doesn't fall within an epsilon ball of the true data. Or you might introduce a softer kernel, such as a Gaussian kernel, which downweights parameters if the simulation that it produces is far from the true data. There are other examples, but these are perhaps some of the more common ones. And in each of these cases, the experimenter has to make a choice about the summary statistic and/or distance measure that they use in the ABC procedure. And this can be a tricky choice to make when it comes to dealing with time series data of different kinds. For example, even in the case of standard univariate time series, there might be strong dependencies over time between the different points in the series, and you would need to account for that strong dependency structure when designing summary statistics or distances that compare different series. And so this sort of data can already be fairly tricky to deal with. However, there are even more complicated cases, such as the case of multivariate time series, where there may exist strong temporal dependencies both within each channel, but also then possibly between the different channels of that multivariate sequence. And again, this needs accounting for when trying to capture the essence of this sort of data, or devising notions of similarity between different time series data of this kind. But of course, it doesn't stop there, because real-world processes and data can be even messier than this. For example, the observation in the time series may not even be regularly spaced, and this could be perhaps because of practical issues in the real world, meaning that the underlying continuous process could only be sampled at a variable rate, as I've shown here, or because the real-world process and the model that you're using to simulate that process are fundamentally event-based, such that the spacing between events isn't fixed. So this adds an additional layer of complexity that we'd like to be able to handle, ideally in some ABC procedure for time series data if we can. But then another possibly even more complex scenario is one where the observations themselves in this potentially irregularly sampled series aren't even vector valued, and may instead consist of more general objects, such as, for example, graphs or images. Say that if we're modeling a social network or modeling transmission dynamics of a virus in some spatial domain. And so it would be nice to, if we can, think up an approach to ABC that can handle all of these sorts of different simulators within that inference procedure. So the problem that, as we saw it, was that there appeared to be relatively few approaches to ABC in the literature that were particularly suitable to the case of time series data of the kinds that I've just scrolled through in the previous few slides. So for example, the prototypical approach, I guess, to doing ABC would be to write down some summary statistics yourself and hope that these summary statistics that you've written down capture all the information that you need to make good inferences about the parameter. But in general, this can be tricky. So it can be difficult to know what you should care about in your data when it comes to arbitrary models and arbitrary time series. And the costs associated with this approach, both in terms of the time spent searching for and experimenting with suitable summary statistics and the computational resources expended in doing so, could be unacceptable or intolerable. And it's also risky, as I said, because it can be difficult to know what information exactly you're throwing away when you do this, and how that loss of information will affect your inferences. So I guess possibly partly in response to this problem, there have been a few different works over the years on finding automatic or semi-automatic or summary-free approaches to constructing distances or summary statistics for ABC. For instance, Fernhead and Prangle in 2012 published a paper on what's become known as semi-automatic ABC, in which they argue for the use of the true posterior mean as a summary statistic in ABC, since this results in well-calibrated ABC posteriors that have good point estimates. And so in this case, the summary statistic, which again I've denoted with boldface S, is obtained by regressing parameters theta onto a simulation X that has been generated by that parameter, which would give an estimate of the posterior mean when a regression function that is trained to go from X to the corresponding theta is trained on a quadratic loss. And as we'll see in experiments later, that this approach can work well. But as far as I could see, one of the drawbacks of this approach is that you would need to define a suitable space of functions over which you optimize when performing this regression task. And the approach that the authors mainly take is to write down a larger set of summary statistics and use these as regressors in a perhaps regularized linear regression model. But the danger here then is that you're faced with the same problem as in the previous case, where you need to define a set of summary statistics that you believe are informative about the parameter that you're inferring. And that can be tricky when you have the sort of high dimensional dependent data that we were discussing a few slides ago. And I know that there are other approaches that people have considered in the literature, and perhaps using neural networks to perform this regression task and incorporating appropriate inductive biases into the network architecture. But then the question of generating sufficient training data on top of the already fairly large simulation budget required by ABC arises, and that can also limit that sort of an approach. So the question of what space of functions we should search over still sort of remains there. Another semi-automatic or automatic approach was later published by Park et al. In 2016, in which these authors proposed to use the maximum mean discrepancy as between the empirical measure associated with the real data and the simulated data as the discrepancy measure in ABC. And the way that this works is by first choosing a sufficiently expressive kernel, K, and mapping the real and simulated data to their so-called kernel mean embeddings in the reproducing kernel Hilbert space associated with that kernel K. And then the distance that's used in ABC is that maximum mean discrepancy, or the MMD, between those kernel mean embeddings. The problem with this approach when it comes to time series data, however, is that the points in the data set are treated as exchangeable, which destroys any information that's present in the ordering of the observations in the time series. And in general, this information will be important. You know, the ordering with which events occur will be important for your inferences in general. And you know, when the authors considered a time series model in their paper, they applied this approach without any modification to account for the fact that there's a natural ordering to the points in the observed sequence. So that's another approach that in its current form isn't particularly well suited to time series data. Another similar idea was discussed by Burnton et al. In their 2019 paper on using the Wasserstein distance as the discrepancy in ABC. And in this paper, the focus is once again on independent observations, but the authors do provide a number of possibilities for how to extend the proposal to the case of time series data. One of the most appealing of which is to consider what I think they call the Wasserstein curve matching distance, where there is a separate term added in this distance function between observations in the two sequences you're comparing that penalizes or discourages the matching of points in the two sequences that are separated temporally. And while this does account for the ordering of observations to some extent, this term does only act to penalize the act of matching observations that are temporally separated. And the Wasserstein distance computation will still permit the ordering of observations to be shuffled when it computes the minimum transportation cost. So in this way, it also doesn't properly account for the natural sequential ordering of observations in time series data. The approaches that I've mentioned, these aren't the only approaches that have tried to build semi-automatic or summary-free discrepancy measures for ABC. Others, such as this 2018 paper on ABC with the KL divisions, and this 2020 paper on ABC with the energy statistic, these are similar approaches to the papers that I've just outlined. And a lot of these different approaches are reviewed and compared in a recent paper by Durania and Fraser. But a common theme of a lot of these works is that independent or IED data are the focus. And I think possibly only in the case of the Wasserstein ABC paper is there a discussion of how the method might be extended to the case of sequential or time series like data. So with that, the question still remains of how we might contribute to this line of literature on semi-automatic or automatic or summary-free approaches to ABC that are perhaps better suited or more suitable for time series data of different kinds. And that's where we try to contribute with this work on ABC with path signatures. In particular, we propose two approaches to performing ABC for time series simulators. And this will be the focus of the rest of this talk. And to introduce these methods, I'll first give a brief overview of what path signatures are and some of their key properties as they relate to our use of these things in ABC. I'll then describe the two signature-based ABC methods that we propose and investigated, and then I'll finally present some experimental results that we've seen with these methods, and then conclude. So to introduce signatures, I'll first define a path H, taking values in some Hilbert space, which I'll denote with a calligraphic H. And this is indexed with a time index that runs over the interval 0 to t. And we'll assume throughout, unless stated otherwise, that this path is a path with finite total variation, so that this term is non-infinite. And I'll explain in a second why this assumption is useful and appropriate. But then with this setup, the signature of a path is this infinite collection of tensors of increasing order, where the mth order tensor is obtained by evaluating this mth order iterated integral, which consists of these m nested integrals, where you evaluate the first one and work your way outwards. And the reason for introducing this assumption about the path being of a banded variation here is just that these integrals can then be taken in a Riemann-Stieltjes sense, although when this condition isn't met, you can define the integrals in some other suitable sense. And so I guess this is a relatively abstract introduction to signatures. So just to give a bit more intuition and to make this a bit more concrete, I'll give a common example that appears in the signature literature. And in this example, we'll consider a 2D path, H, with components A and B. And in this little diagram here, I've drawn an example two-dimensional path with this green curve. And through this example, we can see a bit more easily how the signature captures geometric features of the path and how the signature has some geometric interpretation. So for example, in this case, the order 1 terms of the signature, which are these two integrals here, we can identify them as simply the increments along each of the two dimensions or the two components of the path over that time interval, which is what are these brackets that I've drawn here. And then additionally, these yellow and blue areas above and below the path correspond to the off-diagonal elements in this order 2 tensor appearing in the signature. So this lower diagonal term is this top area enclosed by the path, and similarly the lower area is this upper diagonal term. And then higher order signature terms capture other higher order information regarding the order of points along the path and area enclosed by the path. But these things are less easily visualized. But nonetheless, it captures geometric features about the path. And in fact, as I'll mention again in a second, the full signature, that being all infinite tensors, capture all possible geometric features of the path and describes the path fully. So that's briefly what signatures are. And I know when I've spoken about this before, some people have asked, it seems like it's a bit arbitrary, and people have wondered where these things have come from and why iterated integrals and so on. So just to try and answer some of those questions, I wanted to say quickly that these signature objects crop up in solutions to differential equations of various kinds. For example, in this linear stochastic differential equation here, driven by Brownian motion, this equation has a solution of this form here, where this S term here is these are the order m tensors that appear in the Stratonovich signature of the Brownian path that drives this differential equation, and where the integrals are taken over the interval 0 to t rather than the entire interval as in the previous slide. So the signature appears in a solution to this sort of differential equation. But that's not all. More generally, the closely related notion of what's called a multiplicative functional is at the heart of Terry Lyons' rough path theory, which is an integration theory for controlled differential equations driven by rough and irregular paths that was developed by Terry Lyons in the 90s. And so signature-like objects play a central role in this very general theory of integration. So I hope that goes some way to answering the question of, why iterated integrals and where they come from, and yeah, where they come from. So there are two more things that I wanted to discuss about signatures before moving on to our specific contributions. And the first of these are the key properties of signatures that are relevant to our use of the signature in ABC. And the first of these is the uniqueness of the signature for injective paths with common origin. And so by that, I mean, when I say injective paths, I mean paths that don't retrace their steps at any point along the curve. And by common origin, I just mean that they start at the same place at time 0. And in practice, when working with real data, these things are easy to enforce, which ultimately means that the signature is essentially an injective map for paths or for sequences. The second property of signatures that I wanted to highlight is that they enjoy a universal nonlinearity property, meaning that linear functionals of signatures are dense in the space of continuous real value functions on compact sets of paths. And just to say this property also, as I'll say a bit later, extends to the signature applied to sequences. So through this property, signatures have good function approximation abilities, and they provide a suitable basis for learning functions on paths and sequences. Finally, and I'm saying this because we make use of this fact in our proposed methods, the signature map has recently been kernelized, meaning that there exist efficient methods for computing the inner products between the signature of two different paths. And this is of course impossible to do naively because there are infinitely many terms in the full signature. But there are methods for evaluating the signature kernel nonetheless. And these capabilities have been developed by Corrali and Oberhauser in 2019 and extended by Salvi et al. In 2020. And in both cases, thanks to a kernel trick recognized by Corrali and Oberhauser, the signature kernel can be evaluated using only an inner product on points in the two paths that are being compared. And as I'll highlight later, this fact will allow us to apply this signature machinery to data that evolves in arbitrary spaces for which a suitable inner product can be defined, meaning that we wouldn't be restricted to working with vector value sequences when we make use of our signature based approaches. So the final thing that I wanted to say quickly with regard to the signatures before I move on to our contributions is the question of bridging the gap between the sort of mathematical setup that I've put forward so far, which has been about paths and Hilbert spaces, and the scenario that we're actually facing reality, which is the case of observing some time series of length n with values in some finite dimensional space, which I've denoted with a calligraphic x. And the first step in bridging this gap is to embed that sequence of calligraphic x valued points as a sequence in a Hilbert space and you can do so by making a choice about the inner product that you place on the data space. And so as you'll recall a second ago, I mentioned earlier that the kernel trick associated with evaluation of the signature kernel is that the signature kernel can be evaluated only by evaluating inner products between points in the two paths. And this means that you can make a choice about what inner product, kappa, you place on the data when you evaluate the signature kernel. And through different choices of kappa, different choices of inner products, you will implicitly embed the observed sequence into some feature space H, which is the reproducing kernel space, Hilbert space associated with that kernel. And as I mentioned before, this is useful and important to point out because it will enable us to work with sequences in arbitrary spaces, provided that a sensible inner product can be placed on that space. The second step in bridging the gap between the setup so far and the real scenario that you face in the real world is the question of creating a path out of this now Hilbert space valued sequence. And this one is a bit easier because it's just you can just employ some interpolation scheme to construct the path from those observations. And the usual choice is a linear interpolation. So these are the two steps that bring us from sequences in data space to Hilbert space valued paths, which will then enable us to make use of the properties of the path signature that I described before. So with that introduction to signatures, we can finally move on to our specific contributions. And the first of these is to interpret the signature as a sequence, the signature of a sequence as a summary statistic, which is in fact then a sufficient statistic because it's an objective map of the data. And we can proceed with ABC by taking the discrepancy to be the squared distance, or the distance between the signatures of those two sequences. And this can be evaluated efficiently using this expansion here and the signature kernel that I spoke about a second ago. The properties of the signature then allow us to make some useful theoretical statements about the signature ABC posterior. For example, the fact that it converges to the true posterior as epsilon goes to 0 under certain regularity conditions on the likelihood function, and some additional benign conditions on the inner product kappa that you place between on points in the data space. And additionally, the fact that it converges weakly to the ABC posterior on the full path for a continuous time process when the sampling rate is taken to infinity over a fixed time interval. So that's the first approach that we propose, and we call it signature ABC. And then the second approach that we propose and that we call signature regression ABC involves exploiting the universal nonlinearity property of signatures to perform semi-automatic ABC in the vein of Fernhead and Prangle. So the reason for doing this is because of as I said, the universal nonlinearity property, where the signature has good function approximation properties, and this is also a result of the fact. So this also results in the fact that the signature kernel is a universal kernel both for paths and for sequences. So using the signature to perform the regression task in Fernhead and Prangle's semi-automatic ABC approach, we should be able to approximate the posterior mean estimator arbitrarily well using linear functionals of signatures. So in this way, you can sort of think of the signature as providing the initial set of summary statistics that act as the regressors in the semi-automatic approach described by Fernhead and Prangle. So for example, you could take the signature kernel and kernel ridge regression along to estimate the posterior mean for time series data of different kinds, and then make use of those posterior mean estimates in a discrepancy measure used in ABC. So those are the two approaches that we propose, signature ABC and signature regression ABC. And so to finish the talk, I'll give some examples of the sort of empirical performance that we see with these methods and how they compare to some of the more popular semi-automatic or summary-free approaches to ABC in the literature that we discussed earlier. And the first example that I want to show is the Ricker model. This is an ecological model with complex and sometimes chaotic dynamics that models the size of a population as it evolves over time. The model takes this form, where the n can, I guess, be interpreted as a sort of intensity, population intensity over time, where epsilon, these are random, standard normal random variables, while the observations that you get out from the model are Poisson distributed random variables with a time varying mean given by this expression here. And so we assume that we observe the YT that are emitted from this Poisson distribution, and we consider the task of approximating the posterior for these three parameters, log of r, phi, and sigma, using a pseudo data set generated from the model at parameters 4, 10, and 0.3, and using these independent uniform priors over those three parameters. And this is, I think, a relatively standard setup for this inference problem in ABC. So we obtain with that pseudo-truth data set, we obtain an approximate ground truth posterior using particle MCMC, and compare our signature-based methods to the Wasserstein curve matching distance that I described earlier, the maximum mean discrepancy, and the semi-automatic distance, each one of which I discussed earlier in this talk. And so these are the results. On the left, I'm showing box plots for the Wasserstein distances between the ABC posteriors and the approximate ground truth posterior we got with the particle MCMC. And where the box plots are created by running the same inference procedure with 20 different random seeds. And then in the middle, I'm doing the same thing, but with the maximum mean discrepancy between the ABC posteriors and the ground truth posterior as the measure of performance. And then on the right here, I'm showing box plots for the squared distance between the ABC posterior mean and the approximate ground truth posterior mean, just to assess how well point estimates are being recovered with these different methods. Our signature-based methods are shown in light blue in the bottom 3 rows of these plots, while existing approaches are shown in purple in the top half of these plots. And as you can see, our signature-based methods are doing fairly well compared to some of these other methods, perhaps with the exception of the semi-automatic approach shown in the middle here. So just to give a bit more detail on this middle approach here, the regressors used in the semi-automatic approach were the summary statistics described by Simon Woods in his 2010 paper on this model. And these are, I guess, are summary statistics that are known through experimentation to be informative of the parameters being inferred, and have been handcrafted by Simon Wood himself. So I think it would be fair to argue that this sort of approach has something of an unfair advantage over the other approaches, which I think is a reason why it's quite cool that we're able to meet and in some cases exceed the performance of that method with our signature regression ABC approach. Just to quickly explain what this delay here means in the parentheses, this means that we've applied this transformation here to the data before computing distances, or summary statistics, where you take the final n-1 points in the sequence and stack them on top of the first n-1. And this was inspired somewhat by the discussion of delay reconstructions in the Wasserstein ABC paper. We found that it seemed to improve the performance or the overall shape of the posterior when applied to the signature ABC method, although it reduced the accuracy of the ABC posterior mean a little. But we didn't see that we applied it to the Wasserstein ABC approach, given that it was inspired a bit by that discussion, but didn't see it much of an improvement in this in that case. So that's the Ricker model. The next model I wanted to talk about was what's called a generalized stochastic epidemic model. This is a stochastic model of transmission and recovery dynamics in a discrete population, where the infection and recovery rates are controlled by parameters beta and gamma. The simulation is an event-based simulation model. So events occur with a time-dependent rate in this discrete population, and we observe all these events over a fixed time interval 0 to t. And this means that when we take as output of the model the full history of the epidemic over time, including all infection and recovery events, what we get out from the model is a multivariate time series with irregularly spaced observations and a random length. So the kind of time series data that we're facing with this model is arguably a bit more complex than the high dimensional than in the previous case with the Ricker model. And so with this as output of the model, and with gamma priors on the beta and gamma parameters, the posterior is actually available in closed form, which is a result from Theodor Caprice's thesis. And we therefore perform inference on beta and gamma using a pseudo-true data set generated by the model, and using the fact that the posterior is available in closed form, we can compare the ABC posteriors to the true posterior. So this is what, this is what I'm showing here. Once again, on the left, I'm showing hotspots with a Bayesian distance between the ground truth and the ABC posteriors. And in the middle, the same again with the MMD between posteriors. And finally, on the right, I'm showing the squared distance, the hotspots with the squared distance between the ABC posterior means and the ground truth posterior mean. And in this case, we see that our signature ABC method has somewhat of an edge over the Bayesian ABC approach. And that both of these approaches actually, we saw, had a very significant advantage over the MMD as the discrepancy measure. So much so that I had to omit it from these plots just to be able to distinguish the performance of the Bayesian and signature ABC approaches. So through this, we see that our signature-based approach can also produce competitive behavior even in the slightly more complex case of a multivariate time series with irregularly spaced observations and a variable length. So the final example that I wanted to talk about is one that illustrates a point that I was trying to make a few times throughout this talk, which is the fact that the signature map has been kernelized over recent years, and the fact that our signature-based approaches to ABC are also kernelized, which means that this will allow us to apply all of the signature machinery that exists to data evolving in arbitrary spaces for which a suitable inner product can be defined, meaning that we're not restricted to vector value sequences, for example. So for example, equipped with a suitable kernel on graphs, such as a Weiss-Filler-Lim kernel, we can apply our signature-based methods to parameter inference problems that arise for dynamic graph simulators that have intractable likelihood functions. And this can be useful when, say, you're modeling a social network or modeling dynamic brain networks in neuroscience. So just to demonstrate this capability, we considered a simple dynamic graph simulation model in which edges appear and disappear over time. In particular, if an edge is absent at the previous time step, then it appears in the next time step with probability phi, otherwise it remains absent. And if an edge is present at the previous time step, then it will disappear with probability tau, or otherwise remain present. We then apply our signature ABC methods to a pseudo-true data set simulated from the model, where the red points in these two plots show the location of the true parameters that generated that pseudo-true data set. And on the left here, I'm plotting samples from the prior density, which is just two independent uniform priors in the interval 0 to 1. And on the right-hand side up here, I'm showing samples from the signature ABC posterior in blue. In both cases, these are in blue. And as you can see, our signature ABC posterior samples are concentrated in the vicinity of the true parameters, which suggests that our signature-based approaches can be applied successfully in even these more exotic settings too, involving non-Euclidean sequences. So those are the results I wanted to show you. I also just wanted to give one final note on the computational complexity and the computational costs of our signature-based methods before I conclude, just in the interest of giving a sort of as comprehensive an overview of our signature-based methods as possible in this 45-minute talk or so. So in terms of the computational complexity for the signature kernel, this is order n squared, where n is the length of the sequences that you're comparing. And as far as I understand it, this is the same in the case of the MMD, where the n is the length of the sequences. And both of these, as I understand it, are favorable compared to the Bayesian distance computations, which, for example, can be order n cubed in multivariate settings with the Hungarian algorithm. So that's the sort of complexity that we're dealing with. However, in terms of the actual realized computational costs in the experiments that I spoke about, we did observe that our signature-based methods tended to incur a larger computational cost than the other methods against which we compare. There were some exceptions to this, but generally speaking, there was a higher computational cost. However, there are some possible remedies here. For example, the use of GPUs in evaluating the signature kernel, which will significantly accelerate the computation speed of that kernel. And we didn't use that at all. We even used CPUs. And also there are approximations to the signature kernel that can be introduced, such as considering what's called a truncated signature kernel, which computes the inner product as you would obtain by considering only finitely many terms in the signature, rather than all infinite terms. The other thing to point out, I guess, is that these are relatively new methods, and the differences in these realized costs might be down to factors such as implementation, or around the specific implementation that as they currently stand. So it might be that as signatures are applied more in computational statistics and in machine learning, faster implementations might emerge over time. So that's really everything I wanted to say. I'll just summarize and conclude. So in this talk, I discussed the problem of performing ABC when the simulator that you have is a dynamic stochastic simulation model generating some kind of time series. I discussed some of the issues that you might, or some of the difficulties that you might face when dealing with these sorts of settings. And through this, I try to motivate the use of path signatures as a summary statistic and as an actual feature set for performing semi-automatic ABC for time series simulators of different kinds. And we saw through numerical experiments that such approaches can produce more accurate approximations to the classical Bayesian posterior than existing automatic or semi-automatic or summary-free approaches in the literature, and can be applied in a broad range of cases and to time series of varying complexity. So thanks for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions.